Hello, good morning. A warm welcome to everybody of our meeting today on the final dissemination event for the Gender Equality Plan Impact Study. A warm welcome to our speakers of today and also to all those of you who are following us live from our Research and Innovation Community platform. And apologies for starting with 10 minutes delay, but we had a couple of technical issues. This event is simultaneously live streamed on YouTube. And for those of you who did not have the chance to follow us live, you can also watch it again. The recording will be shortly available on our community platform. My name is Katja Reppel. I'm the head of unit for democracy and European values in the Director General for Research and Innovation. It includes the gender sector, which is really the driving force behind the Gender Equality Plan initiative. And I have to convey you the apologies from our director, Irene Norstedt. Unfortunately, she had a last-minute emergency and couldn't join us today. But I'm very happy to replace her today and would like to welcome you to this dissemination event, presenting and discussing the final key findings of our one-year study that we have commissioned to a consortium of contractors led by ECORIS. The study is about the impacts that EU and national policies and programs had in promoting gender equality plans in research organizations, and what did it actually had as effect on gender equality across the European research area. Many of you watching us today are now very well aware that the European Commission significantly strengthened provisions for gender equality in the current framework programme for research and innovation, Horizon Europe. We are now requiring that all higher education institutions, research organizations and public bodies from member states or countries associated to Horizon Europe have in place a gender equality plan, and that has to fulfill a set of mandatory process-related requirements as an eligibility criterion to participate in the program and access Horizon Europe funding. As this study shows, impacts of this new policy can already be attested at national level across member states and associated countries and within their academic and research organizations. But gender equality plans have not been invented by Horizon Europe. There have been a policy instrument for institutional change in research organizations encouraged by the EU for now over a decade. Actually, since 2012, the European Commission's communication on the European research area has introduced this concept. It was followed by Council conclusions on advancing gender equality in the era in December 2015, and the member states have been encouraged to create a legal and political policy environment to provide incentives and to engage in partnerships with funding agencies, research organizations and universities to foster cultural and institutional change through gender equality plans. And the European Commission has supported this policy approach through dedicated funding for the implementation of gender equality plans, or GEPs, as we call them. Over 200 higher education and research organizations have been supported for the implementation of GEPs through the 7th Research Framework Programme and Horizon 2020. They were together in 30 collaborative projects and received a budget of over 72 million euros. In addition to this, the Commission has funded many policy and practice supporting projects and activities, such as communities of practice on gender equality plans, training and capacity building, online tools, and transnational networks involving national authorities and national research funders. As this study also illustrates, building on previous analysis, several countries across the era have been particularly proactive towards the advancement of gender equality in research and innovation through GEPs. Some are long-standing champions and others more recent frontrunners. And some individual academic and research organizations have also been trailblazers and leading the way in their countries, having had an impact on their national policy frameworks. The new European Research Area Framework proposed by the Commission in 2020 and the ERA Policy Agenda 2022 to 2024, adopted by the Council in November 21, further reaffirmed the need for institutional change. But this time with the ambition to open up gender equality policies in research and innovation to intersections between gender and other social characteristics and identities, and potential grounds for discrimination. Through the development of so-called inclusive gender equality plans adopting an intersectional approach. Today, the study team from our contractor ECORIS will present the study's methodology and its key research findings, including a number of good practice examples, and they will also offer some policy recommendations for future developments. The results will then be discussed by distinguished experts with a large experience on gender equality plans through 3 successive panels moderated by ECORIS colleagues. Many thanks to these experts for their participation in the event, and so many thanks for sharing your insights. And now, without further ado, I give back the floor to Andrea Broughton, Research Director at ECORIS and coordinator of this study. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Katja, and thank you so much for stepping in and for setting the scene for our seminar so well. So good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to this dissemination event on the impact of gender equality plans, or GEPs, across the European research area. As Katja said, I'm Andrea Broughton. I'm a director in the European Social Policy team at ECORIS, and I'll be moderating the event. As Katja said, the event will present and discuss the key research findings of the study that was commissioned by DGRTD from ECORIS, Visionary Analytics and EFIS, and it was commissioned early last year. And we're examining specifically the impacts that EU and national policies and programmes have had supporting or imposing GEPs in research organisations have actually had on equality across the European research area. And the research also contains good practice examples and policy recommendations. So we've got quite a packed agenda, as you can see from this slide. So after the welcomes, we're going to have a presentation which gives an overview of the key findings of the study presented by ECORIS. And after that presentation, we will have 3 panels. So the first panel, as you can see, will be on the impacts and benefits of EU and national policies for GEP development and implementation on gender equality in research and innovation institutions. The second panel will then focus on monitoring and evaluating GEPs at EU level, national level, and institutional levels, and look at a few key promising practices and some of the remaining barriers to the implementation of GEPs. Then we'll have a quick 10-minute e-coffee break before coming back for the final panel session, and that will look at how to facilitate the development of inclusive GEPs. So that will look at the opportunities, the challenges, and the policy gaps. And then Katja will come back and give us some concluding remarks at the end of the seminar. So just a few notes on meeting etiquette. I'm sure I don't really need to tell you. I'm sure you're all seasoned participants are at e-meetings, but those of you who have access to mics, please mute your mic when not speaking. Please avoid any background noise. Those of you following us through live streaming, and everybody, please use the Slido app if you want to ask questions. That's in the panel sessions. So not during the first presentation where you can store up questions, but particularly we would like to hear from you in the panel session. So we will collect questions from you. If you use the Slido app, the QR code is on the screen there. So you will, if you have that app, you will be able to see the questions that are asked. If you like the questions asked, please give it a thumbs up so we can see how popular questions are. And then we can put the most popular ones to the panelists. So I think that's all from me. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Monica Andreescu, who is Associate Director in our team at ECORIS, and she's going to give an overview of the context of the study and a presentation of the headline findings. So Monica, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and good morning from me too. To everyone following us, we thank you very much for being here today. The presentation that you'll hear in the first minutes of our event select a few headline findings from our study, but these won't be the only ones that you will hear. My colleagues that will be moderating the three panels that you heard Andrea present earlier will also give you some other findings, so an overview of other key findings of the study. So in terms of the objectives of the study, you've already heard both Andrea and Katja mentioning them earlier, but just a quick reminder for also for anyone joining us a bit later. The study has been aiming to, first of all, identify and analyze the recent policy developments regarding GEPs in the RNI sector at EU, national and institutional level throughout the past decade. Then to analyze the impact of these policies that have been supporting or imposing GEPs on gender equality in RNI across the era, but also on RNI quality and efficiency. And also to identify examples of policies or other measures supporting GEPs to indicate where there are promising developments, but also identify the key challenges and barriers to achieving the intended impact. The scope of the research, as you might have gathered already, has been the 27 EU member states plus the associated countries to Horizon Europe. We have been looking for the key policy developments and evidence of impact throughout the past decade. And in doing so, we have used a mixed method. We have used mixed methods, including stakeholder consultations, to which many of those of you listening to us today and contributing to the panels have contributed as well. We've also done desk review and analysis of qualitative and quantitative sources, including Eurostat documents, various reports at national and EU level, and also policy documents. And we have also implemented an online survey that many of you also might have answered when it was publicized in the summer of last year. Going on to the next slide, please. This is a short overview of the activities that we have done throughout the past 14 months or so. We started with an inception phase where we designed and reviewed the research tools that we used. Then an interim phase that represented the bulk of the data collection, where we collected data through the methods that I mentioned a bit earlier. And this resulted in the drafting of a series of outputs that you can see most of them listed on the next slide. So the main deliverable for the study has been an impact report, which will be published soon. We have had 5 case studies that have looked into specific countries and specific institutions to try to understand the impact of the development of GEPs on gender equality, but also on RNI efficiency. We have also drafted a series of policy briefs on different topics. If we go to the next slide, you will catch a glimpse of these topics. I won't go through them in very much detail, but just to mention some of them. For example, we focused one of the briefs on the role of inclusive GEPs and on the progress made in implementing them throughout the past years, but also the challenges remaining ahead. So you'll hear a bit more about this in the third panel. We also focused on monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of the GEP eligibility criterion and Horizon Europe, but also on measuring the progress at EU and national level on inclusive GEPs. One other policy brief has been dedicated to gender-based violence, including sexual harassment. But we have also dedicated 2 briefs to very important aspects regarding the development and implementation of GEPs. And these were the organizational structures, but also the role of senior leadership in GEP development and implementation. So the case studies alongside the policy briefs and the impact report present an overview of the research findings in relation to the developments that we have witnessed in the past decade, and also the evidence of impact that we were able to identify. Next slide, please. In terms of starting to present some of the key findings, as you very well know, this is no news to anyone listening to us today, I think. But there have been a wide range of EU-level initiatives throughout the past decade. And this has meant policy documents, practical tools, but also capacity building and knowledge sharing support that was given at the EU level for the member states and for different institutions in the member states, and also associated countries that have participated in these networking, but also capacity building events. Some of the key policies at the EU level and initiatives, you've already heard Katja mention some of them. So one of them was the 2015 conclusions on advancing gender equality in the European research area. Then a bit closer to the 2020s, then there is the gender equality strategy of the EU, the 2020 ERA communication, the 2021 Ljubljana Declaration, and the Pact for RNI, and the list doesn't stop here. So, and of course, the GEP eligibility criterion has been one of the key strategic aspects that have moved the discussion and implementation of GEPs, the discussion about and implementation of GEPs in a positive direction in the last years. So our research found that these EU-level initiatives have been among the most impactful drivers of GEP development and implementation through a range of elements, but overall, the overarching result has been that they legitimized efforts to address inequalities related to gender equality, but also broader equalities in the R&I sector. For the past decade, so between 2010 and 2020, the European Commission has supported the implementation of GEPs in over 200 institutions, both RRPOs and RFOs, and both through the FP7 and Horizon 2020 programs. And of course, this goes on with the Horizon Europe program. As I was saying earlier, the introduction of the GEP eligibility criterion for all public bodies, higher education institutions, RPOs and RFOs from EU member states that were aiming to participate in Horizon Europe has been one key milestone. It provided a strategic impetus for change. And we have also found evidence that it also caused spillover effects in institutions that were not actually covered by this criterion. Two of the main forces behind this were the shared definition of a GEP, which was established at the EU level through the eligibility criterion, and this provided a unifying force guiding national and institutional efforts. Then in terms of the main types of impact that we've identified as a result of the EU level initiatives. Moving on to the next slide, please. We've seen evidence across the different member states in terms of improved institutional processes at institutional level. The funding, of course, the availability of funding at the EU level for implementing and developing GEPs, but also for participating in capacity building exercises has also been one very important aspect. This has resulted also in increased international collaboration. There have been also concrete positive effects on representation of women in certain institutions. There has been a strengthened gender mainstreaming effort, also in regional funding bodies. There have been structures specifically created to share the knowledge, exchange best practices, and set up communities of practice. And there has also been increased awareness towards gender equality. The EU level initiatives have not been standing alone. There were also a range of national policies, programs, initiatives that were implemented throughout the past 10 years, but also some of them were older than that. And in some countries, the gender equality actions, including the early development of GEPs, started even before the past decade. But one of the key developments at national level have been the ERA national action plans, which have been key instruments in promoting gender equality. They have been implemented in different ways at national level. There are different approaches, as expected, tailored to the national context. But they have so far shown a lot of potential to develop the approach towards consolidating gender equality in the R&I sector. But of course, one of the most important aspects of these national plans have been that they have represented the catalyzing impetus. For example, in the setting of the 2012 Gender Equality and Gender Mainstreaming in Research, which was a top ERA priority, and thus signaled to the member states that promoting GEPs in research organizations was a priority at the EU level. There are also national requirements for adopting GEPs or similar policies or measures to GEPs, which have also been important to promote progress in this area, but there have also been other concrete measures. So our research found that there are a couple of overall types of these national level policies. Moving on to the next slide, please. Some of them were measures to support and or impose the implementation of GEPs. So, for example, in a report that was done in 2021, there were 13 countries were identified as having a GEP requirement in the legislation for higher education institutions at national and regional levels. And some countries have set up support structures to facilitate the adoption of GEPs. There are also other types of measures. So, for example, measures that align with the ERA gender equality objectives and the Horizon Europe GEP building blocks. So these requirements, for example, request an increase in the share of women in all fields, for example, through the introduction of quotas that the institutions and those respective countries must comply with. There are also criteria introduced in some countries to ensure higher gender equality in recruitment and career progression at the institutional level. The integration of the gender dimension into research content and teaching was also one of the areas that has been developed in some countries. But still, according to our research, this remains a bit less frequently addressed than other measures. And there were also measures against gender-based violence that were implemented at national level. The types of impact that our research found in relation to the introduction of national policies include an increased gender equality aware culture, a more specific engagement and commitment from department heads, so from top leadership, in relation to acknowledging gender balance issues and also promoting higher equality. Another type of impact has been the development of GEPs at scale in public and private higher education institutions. These, for example, have supported equal pay in terms of employment. And there is also evidence from the research that we've done that there have been support structures being developed to support the effective implementation of GEPs. However, overall, notwithstanding the good examples that we found of impact related to policies introduced to support GEPs, and in turn, evidence related to the effects of the implementation of GEPs, there is still a big data gap related to quantitative evidence of impact. So this has been one of the key findings alongside the many examples that the impact report, policy briefs, and case studies show in terms of impact. Going on to the next slide, please. We've also looked a bit into the contextual factors that have influenced these developments, since of course it's not easy to identify or attribute the direct causal effect of the implementation of GEPs or the direct effective implementation of certain measures on how GEPs are being designed or implemented, and further on the effects on gender equality, on various indicators, and also the effects on R&I quality and efficiency. And we know that there are various contextual factors intervening in this causal relationship, and we've looked into some of them. So the key ones that were identified were the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, labor market inequalities, which have been there for a long time. So this is definitely not a new or intervening factor, but they are ongoing, persistent factors which deal with unequal opportunities, unequal wages, unequal job security. The care gap is another contextual factor that has a bearing on national policies aside gender equality. So many more policies that are implemented in the different member states. And also another important contextual factor is the societal awareness related to gender equality, but also cultural beliefs related to gender equality. Moving on, please, with the presentation. Our research also identified a set of enabling factors that have supported the implementation of GEPs in both research performing organizations and research funding organizations. We looked for these factors at both EU and national level, and also institutional level. At the EU and national level, we found that well-developed policy frameworks, articulate frameworks, and also coherent frameworks, so measures that are coherent with each other, provide the favorable conditions and the legitimacy for actions to be taken to support the development of GEPs and gender equality. However, they do not guarantee them. So whether if policies, good developed policies are there at either national or EU level, is not the only factor that will determine whether these are actually implemented and they result in the expected outcomes. Another enabling factor is actually the definition and the building blocks of GEPs, which were clarified and introduced with the GEP eligibility criterion. But mirroring the definition and the building blocks in national frameworks would ensure further coherence in the efforts made. Of course, the sustainable financial, organizational, and human resources factor is a major one. It's been always identified as really a key enabling factor, probably unanimously by all the stakeholders that we've interviewed and consulted for this study. It's a really key factor to ensure sustainability, but also incentivize action. Then opportunities for policy exchange, mutual learning, dialogue, exchange of best practices, participation and capacity building are a set of other key enabling factors. And these have been really driven forward by EU initiatives in the past few years. But also one of the key enabling factors to promote further actions in other institutions is a well-documented evidence base showing actually what the benefits, the concrete benefits of implementing GEPs are at the institutional and also national level. We also have a range of institutional level factors. Some of them are the same. So for example, the financial and human resources aspect, that is a key driver. But also we found that there were examples of good practices where even in the absence of a very well-developed national level framework, the institutions themselves were drivers of change in relation to GEP implementation and trying to ensure actual effects on gender equality. Other key enabling factors at the institutional level are ensuring buy-in from a range of different stakeholders whose involvement and commitment to GEPs is really critical. The commitment of senior leadership, which we've explored quite a bit in our deliverables. Making sure that embedding gender equality principles into overarching policies and measures and processes and governance at the institutional level is also very important to ensure sustainability. And again, this is something that you'll hear us talk about a lot in the second panel. There is a very high weight emphasizing the needs to understand the situation at the institutional level and base gender equality plans on those needs. So the information related so the data that can come from monitoring and evaluation of the needs at the institutional level, but then the monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of GEPs is really critical to ensure the success of effective GEP implementation. And then the further adjustment of measures. Moving on to the next slide. There were also, as you well know, there are also a lot of challenges to developing and implementing GEPs. You've heard me talk quite a bit about the enabling factors. So of course, the reverse of those factors, if they are not there, then they are significant challenges. So for example, insufficient or fragmented resources, be they financial or human resources, result in a lack of sustainability of actions. Then other challenges are fragmented actions that may occur in terms of implementing GEPs, but also inclusive GEPs. The lack of political and policy support, the lack of support from key stakeholders and institutions, or even at the political level, at the national level, but also limited awareness and understanding of how gender equality interacts with other characteristics. So this brings us very much into the area of the challenges and opportunities for developing inclusive GEPs, which you'll hear more about and have an opportunity to discuss more about in the third panel. So I won't go into details now. And again, a lack of systematic data at the institutional but also national level to allow comparisons and understanding over time continues to be one of the key challenges. Moving on, please, with the slides. I'm now getting very close to the end of this presentation so that we can start the discussions in the panels. Our study also had a specific task to look at other international examples. So the ones that we have selected are the ones that you can see on your screen. They are a collection of award schemes, of accreditation schemes, but also legal interventions that have set up new processes to ensure the prevention and counteracting of any discrimination related to gender equality. So you see that we've looked into a set of such international examples, including the Athena Swan Charter in the UK, the SAGE Award in Australia, the Dimensions program in Canada, the US CEA Change program, the NSF Advance program, and some very recent changes in Norway in terms of equality and anti-discrimination included in the legislation, which have brought about changes. So these international examples are similar to a certain degree. So some of them have been inspired by the Athena Swan Charter. Some of them are grant programs. And we've tried to understand the degree to which they can be compared with the GEP eligibility criterion to introduce GEPs. So we have, you will, when the report is published, read, there is an extensive chapter about this in terms of the benchmarking findings. But overall, there are just a few conclusions that I'd like to share with you at this point. So our main conclusion is that the GEP eligibility criterion in Horizon Europe is a unique initiative in itself, relative to the initiatives that we've identified and discussed, because of its systemic approach. So the reach that it has across a lot of different countries and organizations, the fact that it provides a definition of a GEP and the key building blocks, and also its other elements, make this a really unique and specific type of intervention. However, compared with the other initiatives, the international initiatives that we've selected, they all, of course, aim at institutional change to some degree or another. But the GEPs, just because of their scope, are at a much higher level. However, some of the key challenges that you've heard me mention before, which have come across for GEP implementation, are also shared by the other international initiatives. So, for example, in terms of monitoring and evaluation, this is one specific challenge that is shared across these initiatives. In terms of the specific ambitions that the international initiatives that we've selected are the specific ambitions that they foresee, they tend to be formulated in a broad and generic manner, according to the research that we've done. And this is also compounded by the fact that they have quite limited specific targets, which of course make monitoring or evaluation of outputs more difficult. The different initiatives cover different fields. So some of them focus only on STEM, but some of them are broader. There is also a trend towards considering broadening the discussion from just gender equality to the inclusion of different protected characteristics. So this is a similarity with GEPs, of course, looking into intersectionality and building inclusive GEPs. There is also one of the specific findings related to the award schemes was that they ensure continued engagement from the participant organizations. So these were the Athena Swan, SAGE, CEA Change, and Dimensions program in Canada, because this provides an incentive for organizations to commit over the long term. And then again, ending with one common challenge with the development of GEPs in the member states, in the EU member states and the associated countries to Horizon Europe, there is also, in these international examples that we've looked at, limited evidence of impact. specifically on gender equality, but also on R&I productivity and quality. So I think this was the end of my slides. So now, Andrea, back to you. There won't be questions for this part of the presentation, but there will be when we go on with the panel discussions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Monica, for that overview of all the rich findings of the research. And I hope everybody found that interesting and it gives food for thought. We're going to move straight on. We're going to move to the first of our panel discussions. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Gillian Kelly, who's going to be the moderator for the first panel session. So over to you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here today to moderate this first session on the impacts and benefits of EU and national policies supporting GEP development and implementation in R&I institutions. I'd like to firstly start off the panel session with a brief presentation of some of the key research results from our study on this specific topic. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so thanks a lot. So firstly, the study identified a number of benefits that GEPs and other associated EU and national level policies have had, firstly on gender equality in R&I institutions. So the development and implementation of GEPs have really firstly led, as Monica mentioned earlier, to an increased awareness on gender equality, mainly among members of management and research staff in R&I institutions. And a number of R&I institutions implemented, for example, training and workshops and discussions and awareness raising events on gender equality. And the work on the development of GEPs through European projects also allowed some R&I institutions to increase awareness of gender equality work beyond their organisations, which is incredibly positive. Then, according to the majority of survey respondents from our study, as a result of the development and implementation of GEPs, gender equality, as Monica mentioned before, became really a part of organisations' culture. And interviewees really highlighted that the implementation of a GEP, it really does contribute to changing the mindset of individuals and really shifting this organisational culture towards one that is more gender equal. And in light of this, GEPs have led to improved institutional policies and processes in R&I organisations. For example, firstly, it's really improved hiring procedures, like the reduction of gender bias in assessment procedures. It's also helped to improve the working conditions of parents. For example, 72% of our survey respondents did really agree that there was improved work-life balance for staff. There were salary increases and there was improved childcare benefits and services as a result of the implementation of gender equality plans in their institutions. It's also led to new complaints procedures to report mistreatment, harassment, bullying, or inappropriate behaviour in institutions as a result of the GEP. So, for instance, at Reading University in the UK, they developed a harassment support and reporting toolkit as part of their gender equality plan. And also at Manchester University, they developed as part of their gender equality plan a report and support confidential online system. The evidence has also shown from our study that there's been increased and improved career progression and representation of women in senior and leadership positions. And there's also been evidence of a reduction of sexual harassment, discrimination, and gender stereotypes in R&I institutions as a result of GEP implementation. Also, it's been great that there's been advancement of gender-sensitive language in communication also in R&I institutions as a result of GEP implementation and development. There's also evidence of the successful inclusion of gender dimensions in policy documents and research content. For example, one of the main objectives of the Trigger project was to include gender issues and variables in research content. And this was realised in several institutions in Italy, the UK, Czechia and Spain, for example. And then finally, in relation to gender equality, the implementation of GEPs have also influenced local, national and international gender equality policy. For example, the work of the Paris Diderot University under the Trigger project on tackling sexual harassment, it led to the co-organisation of an international conference on the topic. Then next, if we move on to the next slide, there's also, our study also found and identified a number of benefits that GEPs and other associated EU and national level policies have had on R&I quality, efficiency and productivity. In terms of quality, the Gender Action Project really showed that there is this positive association between research excellence and innovation and gender equality. So the project found that the presence of gender equality plans in research performing organisations is actually positively associated with innovation and excellence indicators. GEPs have also led to enhanced research production, creativity and research innovation. And the majority of our survey respondents really agreed that GEP implementation really strengthens the gender dimension in research content, teaching content and curricula, and has led to this increased quality of sex and gender disaggregated data and analysis. There have also been positive links found between gender equality plans and productivity. Many of our interviewees highlighted that GEP implementation really increased the productivity of researchers, and the encouragement of women researchers to pursue professorship careers, to apply for international funding and to carry out research projects due to the implementation of gender equality plans was noted to have generated more effective research at technological institutes, for instance, in Ireland, that participated into the GenderNet, GenderNet Plus and SAGE projects. So that's been incredibly positive as well. And then finally, in relation to efficiency, our study found that there is evidence of improved resource management and teamwork as a result of the development and implementation of gender equality plans. There's also improved communication across departments. For example, at the University of Bologna, this increased inter-cooperation has resulted in the creation of working groups and student associations, which study the concept of gender equilibrium, thereby really improving also the research and innovation quality of the institution. So that's incredibly positive there. There's also been evidence of increased collaboration among R&I organisations as well. So the universities participating in the Gender Time project really observed that the experience of development and implementation of gender equality plans placed them in a strategic position to help other organisations within their respective countries to put a gender equality plan in place and become a national role model in that regard. For example, the Donau University in Austria helped to draft the gender equality plan for the National Austrian Energy Agency. And then finally, GEPs also encouraged the development of national and international networks. And this has, as Monica said, has led to the collaboration and exchange of good practices, experience and knowledge in the sector. So that's been incredibly positive as well in terms of increasing the efficiency in institutions. So that's just a brief overview, complementing really Monica's presentation of the main findings from our study on the topic. So I'd like to now hand over the floor to Dr. Ross Woods, who works as a senior manager at the Higher Education Authority Centre of Excellence for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Ireland. And he possesses over a decade's experience in the tertiary education sector in Ireland and overseas. So we're very happy to have him here today. also as he's been a key expert for our study. So I'd like to just hand over to Ross to give a short reflection from his point of view on the main benefits of gender equality plans, on gender equality and on R&I efficiency, productivity and quality in R&I organisations. So Ross, over to you.
Thanks, Gillian. And thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting to see everything pulled together in one place. Yeah, so I guess I was gonna start off just by making a couple of comments about it, the opportunities and challenges to developing national level policies, because I know that was one of the things that we had discussed beforehand. And I think that what's quite interesting and is emerging from the findings of the report is the importance of capacity building, but also to fund that particular capacity building in terms of developing GEPs. What's quite interesting is the last point I think that Monica made in her presentation, the sense that it's hard to pinpoint what the impact of GEPs is in a traditional sense of how we understand impact. So that has been difficult, because I guess what GEPs are trying to do, and what all gender equality work is trying to do, is to affect culture change. And culture change is probably one of the hardest things to measure. But I think some of the headline benefits of having GEPs are, the first thing is improved data. And before the existence of data, a lot of organizations were not collecting data on their staff and looking at what the gender breakdown was of staff in various positions. The key benefit is the raised awareness of gender equality, the normalization of gender equality work and broader equality work. The other thing that I think we're starting to see is gender equality work in itself becoming recognized within promotion and recruitment processes. So one of the key benefits of GEPs, and I think we see it in all action plans, is around the gender proofing of recruitment and promotion processes, and ensuring that that pipeline becomes stronger, and that we get more female staff into senior positions, particularly into the professoriate. But that's only part of it. It's also important to see these actions where there's a recognition for the work as well, because one of the key issues with the development of the GEP, and I think it was a very good point in relation to the accreditation schemes, that a GEP has to be a living document. It has to be something which is continued, and I think that's where we see the real benefit of GEPs that are, say, for 3 or 4 years, but then they're monitored, they're renewed. We have a second one and a third one and a fourth one. And we see that in some of the more mature member states in terms of gender equality, where institutions are on to possibly their third, fourth, fifth gender equality plan. And this is really how we see that culture change getting embedded. So I'll pass it back to you, Gillian.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ross, for those introductory words. And I think it'll really set the scene for our wider panel discussion, which we're going to have now. We have a wide group of panelists here with us today, which we're very happy to have. So we have firstly Dr. Eileen Drew. She's the director of the Trinity Centre for Gender Equality and Leadership at Trinity College Dublin. And Professor Drew has worked as the gender mainstreaming expert for the Social Security Reform Cooperation Project in China. She holds the position of National Senior Expert to the European Fundamental Rights Agency in Vienna, and provides national expertise for several AGA projects as well. She's also engaged in the Athena Swan initiative in Trinity College, so we're delighted to have her and her here today. We also have Mr. Alexandru Mihai Dinu. He works in the Romanian Executive Agency for Higher Education, Research Development and Innovation Funding. Mr. Dinu is also the Romanian representative of the Caliper project. We also have Dr. Philippe Liotard here. He's the head of the Equality Diversity Mission at University Claude Bernard Lyon 1 and referent for racism and anti-Semitism at the university. He is also the president of the Permanent Conference of Heads of the Equality Diversity Mission, and his area of work really includes violence and discrimination in sport. And he's also involved in the ARCUS European University Alliance project. And then we also have Eva Sophia Myers here today. She's head of the gender equality team at the University of Southern Denmark, and she is the EU SPEAR project coordinator. And her areas of expertise includes, amongst all, gender, psychology, and organizational development. And of course, we also have Ross Woods as part of our panelists here today. So first, we have there a number of questions we would like to ask the panelists. So if we go to the next slide. So we will firstly discuss these 3 questions with our panelists, and then we will also, if you would like to, as Andrea said before, if you'd like to ask any questions from the participants here today, please put them in the Slido. And after these 3 discussions on these 3 questions, we'll also refer to the Slido and we'll get the panelists to answer some of the Slido questions as well. As Andrea said, if you can like any questions that have been posted there, so we know which are the most popular as well. In the interest of time, we won't be able to deal with all questions. So good if you can like questions as well that are on the Slido, so we can ask the most popular questions to the panelists. So firstly, our first question that I'd like to ask to Eileen and Alexandru, what are the documented or expected benefits or impacts that EU and national policy supporting the development and implementation of GEPs have had on gender equality, but also on quality, efficiency and productivity in your different institutions or institutions across the European area that you're aware of? So firstly, could I pass the floor to Eileen?
Thank you very much, Gillian. And it's great to have this opportunity to share some of our stories and hopefully some of the potential and actual gains that have come from EU funding. So my story relates back very closely to use of those enabling factors of linking with a policy framework, having a gender equality plan, building blocks that would be institutionalizing the needs and benefits that need to be implemented, and the importance of incentives, of being able to resource the actions, and the link between EU and national frameworks, because that's very important in terms of exchanges of experience, being able to build upon the gains and benchmark against good policy practice in other institutions. So I'm just going to say a brief amount about the Irish case study, which I think illustrates the benefits of all of those. So back in 2011, 2012, we saw Integer, which was the integration and transformation of research organizations to affect gender equality. Over the next 5 years, we worked in Integer in Trinity with partners in Festa, Limerick, and Genovate in Cork. So we had 3, that's 1.5% of the 200 funded projects of the EU. But I would reckon that as 3 projects that were FP7 and funded, they had a disproportionate impact on Irish policy. What happened was that we had a framework for gender equality plan that was quite tight and quite demanding. And amongst that were all of the quantitative and qualitative benefits that we've been talking about, the awareness, increased representation, and the benefits that would come with that. what we found through the duration by the end of the Integer project was that it was taking it into a national, beyond institutional, into the international sphere. So again, those 3 EU-funded structural change projects brought pressure on national policymakers and research funding organizations to give their commitment to gender equality, to improve the whole quality of the research output in the sector in Ireland. So from 2011, when there wasn't one female leader of an Irish university, by 2023, 7 out of 13 universities are led by women. That's just one of the factors and indicators, because quantitative data are hard to find in terms of impact. But I would say, and the head of my institution, who's a woman provost, would say it couldn't have been done without the groundwork that we put in. So our case study meant that we worked as research performing organizations. We worked closely with the stakeholders, research funding organizations, and also with the instigators and owners of Athena Swan in the UK. And the GenderNet project supported that and opened up another vista of where this requires commitment beyond our institutions and the schools and departments and disciplines within it. So now our projects, our joint projects, those joint EU projects fed international policy. It's now a requirement to have a gender equality plan. It's a requirement to have the Athena Swan Award, at least at bronze level, and then to renew it and move on to silver. And the vetting of all leadership potential candidates as university heads to demonstrate, a requirement that they demonstrate that they have an awareness of gender equality. So these are just 3 that I've picked out of the national story, but the linking of funding to or by research organizations in Ireland to having Athena Swan, having gender equality plans, which must be submitted annually. This has been groundbreaking, and it has been not just impacting at institution level, but impacting across the entire sector at national policy level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Drew. It's incredible to hear of the impact that EU projects, gender equality plans and funding have really had in Ireland, and the advancements that have been made. So thanks a lot for that information. Maybe I pass on the floor to Alexandru from Romania to complement. It would be great to hear your experience from your institution and in Romania, the perspective.
Thank you, Gillian. Yeah, speaking of benefits, I think the most important thing was that during this process that started 3 years ago in Caliper project, we understood that our role in assuring gender equality is greater than we initially envisaged. That having a GEP is not only about taking measures and implementing actions that will bring more equality in our institution, but about the role that we as a funding organization having promoting it. And we understood quite early in the process that it's not only about us, it's about our research community. And that was on one hand awesome, but on the other hand, it proved quite difficult sometimes. Of course, having a GEP and implementing its action created a healthier working climate, as we now have guidance for example, gender-sensitive communication, recruitment, parental leave, or preventing sexual harassment. We are just in the process of organizing training for career progression, for evaluators, and so on. But I think the greater benefit was that in the last years, the topic of gender equality was normalized in our research community. For example, if 3 years ago, when we started and we organized meetings with internal and external stakeholders, as we were discussing the draft of our GEP and the initial measures we envisaged, the discussions were more like, yeah, but why don't we call it equality between sexes or equality of chances, or why do we have to use gender instead of sex? Now, in our community, we can have at least a proper conversation about gender equality, and I think that's very important. Also, having a gender equality plan as criterion for eligibility for funding, I think, yeah, somehow oblige many institutions to start this conversation, but in the meantime, really force many to face the existing inequalities and the way these inequalities perpetuate. Another benefit that I can easily observe, both in our institution and in our research community, is a tendency to discuss gender equality issues easier, and a tendency to become more and more aware of their own unconscious biases and the way those biases interfere with their day-to-day work. And I think that is indeed a great win, that somehow many realize that they weren't actually necessarily keen to take advantage of their privilege. They're just going with the flow without realizing the inequalities and that they were perpetuating in them. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I discovered in the process more allies than I expected, to end on a positive note.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. No, very interesting to hear the situation in Romania as well. Just in the interest of time, I might move on to the next question, which I'd like to ask Philippe and Eva Sofia. So what are the key inputs, tools, activities that have enabled the observed changes in terms of gender equality, quality, efficiency, or productivity in your institutions or in institutions across the European area that you're aware of? So firstly, Eva Sofia, if you'd like to, what's your opinion?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. And I just want to say that I recognize the findings of the study, both the benefits and the barriers, and I think this is really something that is good to have my experience from the ground, so to speak, reflected so one-on-one in the findings. So well done on the report. I would like to say something about I also recognize what has been said so far by Ross and Eileen and also Alex about what the experience is of the benefits of the GEP eligibility criterion. It's been a huge driver in a Danish national context, and I can also say in the SPEAR partners, it's been instrumental both for the institutions involved, but also for the wider national and sometimes even regional push. I think the key inputs of the GEP eligibility criterion is comprehensive construction that tackles many different levels at once, and the insistence on the importance of looking at sexism and also the integration of the gender dimension, both in teaching, research, and innovation, is an important future objective. It hasn't been reached yet, and also the integration of intersectional categories is hugely important, because the work is very important that it's shown that we cannot rest on our laurels quite yet. And we also see this, that where mobilization, at least in the Danish context, is happening on the higher levels, so to speak, or the more easy ones. With establishing data, it's not an easy endeavor in itself, but it's still easier than integrating the gender dimension into research content. Focusing on careers is important, including bias in selection and decision-making processes, and that's still easier than tackling sexism on a integrated scale. I think some of the activities that have helped from the bottom up in the Danish context, and also in some of the other SPEAR contexts, has been a Me Too focus, which has put more sort of comprehensive focus on what this means in real terms, and that it is not so easy to fragment the understanding any longer. I mean, the dots are connected in a way that is harder to look away from. I think also the fact that students are more aware and that researchers' networks are starting to mobilize, and that associations that span more institutions also have this focus. That's also a great driver. I think Ireland, of course, is a shining example to all of us, and especially also that both technical universities have successfully implemented these things, and also elite universities show that it's not an either gender equality focus or an elite excellent research focus.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Eva Sophia. It's really interesting to hear your perspective from the Danish perspective, from the SPEAR project perspective, and it's nice to hear that, you know, making students more aware and the networking really and starting to mobilize people more has really helped and have been key inputs and activities to promote change and gender equality. So I'll move on to Philippe for your inputs here.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank Anne Pepper and Ecoris for the organization of this meeting, which is a very important meeting in order to share what we've learned of the GEP in our own countries. I would like to say, although that in France, the gender equality plan are legal obligation, but very for only 3 years, because the Public Service Transformation Act from 2019 obliged all the public organizations to produce a gender equality plan. And for universities, it was quite a surprise. It doesn't mean that nothing was done, but it was the first time that it was asked to organize all the initiatives for gender equality in a formal document. And public universities and high schools had to propose such a gender equality plan in March 2021. So it's quite new at the national level. And the demand of the ministry contained financial penalties for the universities who do not transmit the gender equality plan in time. So it put pressure on all the universities and organizations. So to ask your question about what I can see as the main transformation, there were four fields that were that structure the French gender equality plan. The first one is about the salary gap, which is a classical one. The second one is about the equal access for women and men to bodies, job, and different grades. The third one is about the balance between professional and personal life. And the fourth one is about the fighting sexual harassment, discrimination, and all kind of discriminations. And maybe the main effect is that between 2021 and now, in almost 3 years, all the universities and high schools are now have implemented a kind of reporting system for gender-based violence, discrimination, a kind of support for victims, and so on. And this is really the main impact of this gender equality plan. It's the fact that gender-based violence was one of the main issues, the main priority. But I can explain this because it is linked to the French Ministry of Higher Education, which asks us to work on this topic prioritarily. So another point is that by now, some universities will modify the first gender equality plan because we have to work on it for 2024 for the second one. And many universities will organize a gender equality plan which include the policy for students, which was not asked by the ministry and which was not organized in many of the gender equality plan which are already implemented. And at least the last thing maybe I could say that it obliged us to work together inside university, for example, the equality diversity officers with human resources, for example, but also working together with different universities, different stakeholders, different conferences, for example. And this is the main part of what is going on today in France. It's the fact that the gender equality plan produced a kind of necessity to work together in a field which is not done all the time, as you know.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your intervention. Really interesting to hear the perspective in France, the legal obligations that have been introduced. And again, it's interesting to hear that the development of networks and working together across institutions is really important and is a key impact from the gender implementation of gender equality plan. So it's nice to hear that there's similarities across the countries which are complementing our study findings, of course. In the interest of time, maybe then I would give the floor to Ross. I know you touched upon some of the key barriers before in your introductory remarks, but I'm not sure if there's anything else you'd like to add in relation to our third question on the key barriers to achieving the expected changes in terms of gender equality, quality, efficiency, and productivity.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. I might before I touch on the barriers, I might just go back to the question of impact, and it was just as I was listening to Eileen give the kind of the Irish story, which is really true. We started really with a grassroots movement engaged with European funded projects in terms of capacity building before we actually had this coherent national approach. But just in terms of impact, I can say that in Ireland in 2016, 19% of university full professors were female. Now, 30% of female professors are, or sorry, female. 100% of female professors are female. 30% of professors are female. To say it more clearly, so that shows a huge jump, and we're looking at a 1% increase year on year. So that is some impact. We don't know the exact correlation. The other thing which I think is really important that gender equality plans, the actions in them, there can be tangible links to impact, and one of those things is around recruitment and promotion processes. We analysed data in Irish universities between 2018 and 2020, all of whom had elaborate gender equality plans, all of which had very strong focuses on the gender proofing of recruitment and promotion processes. 28% of applicants to professorships were female, yet 45% of appointments were female, and we really believe that that's a direct impact of all the work that our colleagues in universities are doing. And just to give a sense of the scale of that, that's 598 versus 1,500 applicants. 58 appointees versus 67. So I think when you actually think about the numbers, and if you think, I know Ireland is a smaller system, but if you actually think about the numbers, that's 9 more male professors were appointed over that period. So I think that really does give a good sense of that. Now, in terms of the barriers, the barriers, I think Alex was quite rightly touched on the barrier, the resistance to change, the desire to maintain the status quo, the insistence that gender inequality is not a problem, and then the other key barrier is really the lack of funding and resources. I think one thing that everyone needs to understand is that yes, a GEP is a living document. It needs to be renewed, it needs to be monitored, but it also needs to be resourced and it needs to be funded. And there need to be not just staff in an institution who have actions within that gender equality plan, but actually staff who are employed to monitor and to implement the plan to ensure that the institution moves forward with it. And really, I think that's those two barriers are the main ones that I've seen. One of the ways in Ireland that we've been able to kind of tackle those barriers is through awareness raising, but also by building a critical mass nationally in terms of people who buy into gender equality and who work on this area. And Eileen has touched on how we have a coherent national policy approach, and I think that's a really important point to make about the Irish example, is that we have a very coherent. Now we're a smaller member state, we have a smaller system, so we have a better situation in that regard, but we have one agency that looks after data collection, that looks after the GEP requirement and its monitoring, that makes national policy recommendations. So there's no splintering of approach in that regard. And what that's enabled us to do is not only have a top-down approach, but we've also seen within the system a development of a really strong community of practice and a really strong practitioner network. And I think that goes back to what Monica said in her introduction, in her piece earlier about the shared understanding of a GEP. Everyone in Ireland knows what a gender equality plan is. Everyone in Ireland knows what it looks like, and everyone is rowing in the same direction to implement them. So, and I think that's another important point, is that working together makes us stronger, and sharing what we do in different countries, but also in different institutions in terms of GEPs is a really important way to break those barriers.
Great, thanks a lot, Ross. Thank you very much. Then I might just briefly take up one question. So thanks a lot for posting your questions on Slido. We'll of course collect and collate them all. Probably in the interest of time, we're running a little late, so might just pick up on one question. And I think the most important thing, as it's Ross mentioned, this issue with funding. And I see that a number of participants have liked this. So I might ask the panel, does the panel think that the impacts will be sustained without continued funding from the EU? Maybe would Eileen like to give your opinion there from your experience with EU funded projects? Do you have any intervention there?
I think again, excuse me, Ireland, it reflects both sides of the funding coin, because we got EU funding to get this kick started, and then it took up momentum and became part of, locked into national higher education policy. But regrettably, there hasn't been the funding support for the actions that we still continue to take. So, for instance, Athena Swan is additional to what we do, but the overheads are paid from the government. So I think funding is a constraint that can hold back gender equality. And I would really welcome the carrot and stick approach, that your funding is under threat, which it is in Ireland, if you do not fulfill the requirements, your gender equality plan, your affiliation to Athena Swan. You could lose the chance to apply for research funding or to get umbrella funding from the government. But I think that should be tempered with some sort of easement and resourcing of the activities that go into what's a very complex area of formulating and developing and implementing gender equality plans. So that'd be my essence of my funding answer.
Thank you very much, Eileen. Okay, well, thank you all very much. I'd like to thank all of the panelists and speakers from this panel, so for all of your excellent contributions and providing your experiences from your institutional and national level. So it's been incredibly enriching. I might pass the floor back to Andrea then for the next panel session. I guess we'll be starting. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jill. And thank you to all the panelists for that session. We are collecting lots of questions in Slido, as Jill said. In the interest of time, maybe what we'll do is we'll carry on collecting them, but we are aware of them and we're aware of your likes as well. we'll move on to the next panel, which is going to be moderated by my colleague Carmen Hoyer. So Carmen, the floor is yours for the next panel.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you very much, everyone, for the participation so far. It's been super interesting. Okay, so now we're going to talk about monitoring and evaluation of GEPs at different levels, the EU level, national, and also institutional. Some promising practices that we've identified during the study, but also remaining barriers. So first of all, following the same structure as the previous panel, I'm going to present briefly our results in this area from the study, and then we can move on to the discussion and the panel session. So, as you know, when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, and particularly of GEPs, but also of gender equality in general, we're doing this in a context of the ERA policy agenda and the new, which sets it was 20, I think now it's 18 actions for member states and associated countries to voluntarily commit to those priority areas and to be able to address the priority areas set out in the Pact for R&I. So the policy agenda establishes the new ERA monitoring mechanism, which is quite broad, quite deep actually, and consists of a policy platform, a scoreboard, dashboard, country reports, and a EU level report, as probably most of you know. And the aim is to provide a view on the state of play of implementation of the ERA policy agenda at the level of the European Union. So within this context, it becomes even more relevant. And there are two main reasons that highlight the importance of implementing and monitoring an evaluation framework to measure gender equality in R&I. The first one is that the proper development of a GEP, of a gender equality plan, should really rely on robust representative data that thoroughly presents the issues faced in a given context or an organization. And this data should enable the scrutiny of the differences between men and women in different roles, directorates, and at different levels of the organization. In parallel, and the second main reason is that consistently collected and comparable data on relevant indicators will allow us to evaluate GEP implementation and measure the progress towards gender equality over time, which is our final objective, and the ability to make well-informed decisions. What has worked, what hasn't, why, how can we improve it, where, process, well, all of this, no? So yeah, the information derived from monitoring and evaluation analysis allows us to acquire a deeper understanding on whether a transformative dynamic is taking place, identify possible deviations from planned interventions, etc. So in terms of the importance of monitoring and evaluation, it becomes critical. And sorry, yeah, next slide, please. The Horizon Europe eligibility criteria. No? As you all know, having a gender equality plan in place is a mandatory eligibility criterion for all public bodies, institutions, and organizations from member states and associated countries to participate in Horizon Europe. And among the mandatory requirements set for the GEPs, the Horizon Europe eligibility criterion mandates data collection and monitoring. So according to our study, the main outcomes of this have been, first of all, an increase in data collected on gender-related indicators in institutions. And we can find good examples of good practices here, like the Ljubljana University in Slovenia, which developed a sex disaggregated database and incorporated gender equality in the institution's mission statement. And among other research organizations that we interviewed for the purposes of the study, it was unanimously reported that the GEP eligibility criterion has definitely been a positive development, encouraging increase in data collection. The second main outcome is that, there are a number of ad hoc projects and initiatives that are arising Very recently in October, the Inspire project was launched, defining practical approaches in GEP monitoring, as well as establishing a set of indicators that can be used across institutions for greater consistency. But there are also other examples, like for example, the FRT project, Gender Action, Casper, Target. Well, you know them probably better than we do. But also building on existing monitoring frameworks that already existed. So there is quite a lot to build on. The She Figures report, the ERA scoreboard and dashboard that we were mentioning, the JRC gender equality monitoring tool, AGES gear tool, etc. Okay, so there is a lot that has been done, and despite the relevance and progress towards the monitoring of GEPs, there are, however, remaining barriers in monitoring and evaluation that we can find in the next slide. And the study has found several of these, no? The first one is that there is very limited data available overall that can be used to assess the situation on a European-wide or national level, particularly regarding the actual implementation of gender equality plans. So data collected at the EU level captures variables on gender equality at different levels, but it does not necessarily cover GEP implementation. Similarly, at the national level, some countries have monitoring systems measuring gender equality, but also lack GEP implementation. There are examples, such as the Austrian Science Fund with the Equal Opportunity Monitoring Initiative to increase the participation of women researchers in Austria. But monitoring GEPs remains at the institutional level mainly, which hinders comparisons across organizations and across the national and EU level. The second one that we would mention is that EU-wide data does not always or not typically include associated countries' data. And the lack of data that we were mentioning is even more prominent for associated countries, as the main EU databases and monitoring exercises tend not to cover ACs or not to cover them all and in different cases. So the approach there is not so consistent always. And this means that sometimes there's a substantial knowledge gap regarding GEP implementation in these countries, which are adhered to Horizon. Thirdly, there are inconsistencies across countries in the way that the variables are measured and what information is collected in the research and innovation sector at the national level. So despite the increase in data collection across countries, there is a great variety in how and what data is being collected, and this becomes a challenge when ensuring comparability across the EU and the national level. Also, there have been ad hoc exercises from EU-funded projects or initiatives, such as the ERA Standing Working Group on Gender and Research and Innovation, but these tend to provide a snapshot of the situation at a given moment in time, and that becomes quickly out of date and also does not allow us to measure evolution over time. So a key feature of any robust monitoring system is its continuity and regular data collection. Therefore, single ad hoc exercises, even though they are useful and they provide information for a given point in time, they cannot be used for monitoring GEPs over time. Well, then this lack of data is particularly important when it comes to gender-based violence. So everything that we've been mentioning is further aggravated when it comes to data on gender-based violence or sexual harassment. And this undermines the ability to make informed decisions about how to prevent and address this type of violence. Gender-based violence is a core challenge in society, and unfortunately, research organizations are not immune to it. There's the UNICEF European-wide survey, which reports and collects data on gender-based violence in academia, and this is a good example and a good practice, but still definitely more needs to be done to address this type of gender-based violence, and more needs to be done in terms of data collection and making it consistent and comparable. So related to this, there is also a lack of data not only in gender-based violence that we were talking about, but also on diversity characteristics, racial, ethnic origin, other socioeconomic or demographic characteristics for vulnerable groups, and how gender interacts with all of them. And this relates a lot to the intersectionality component and the inclusive component of gender equality plans. We need this data to be able to measure progress in inclusive GEPs. But it's true that it's very sensitive data, and legal frameworks in some countries actually forbid data collection or the bringing that data together in the same individual, given the protected and the sensitive nature of this data. But this, of course, hinders data comparability across countries. So all in all, what can we do with these barriers that we identified in terms of monitoring and evaluation? Well, there is no golden pill, of course, but definitely a more consistent approach, agreeing on a common set of indicators at the European level that is endorsed both by member states and associated countries, and developing a monitoring framework that establishes the regular data collection of data on indicators to be able to inform, evaluate, implementation, and measure progress of gender equality plans over time. So yeah, I don't want to take more time presenting, because I know we're a bit short of time. I would like to give the floor to two experts who are in this panel, who have definitely helped a lot in the study and reaching the recommendations. So they are Jörg Müller and Angela Wroblewski. Sorry for mispronouncing. Jörg, please. Jörg is a researcher at the Interdisciplinary Institute, IN3. He has a very strong expertise in sociology and anthropology fields. He's an expert in gender studies, team collaboration, and gender and science policies, and he's also part of the GENTIC group. So please, Jörg, the floor is yours. Feel free to introduce yourself and give us some opening remarks.
Okay, thank you, Carmen. And I think no need to introduce myself further. As you said, I'm Jörg Müller. I work at the Open University of Catalonia. And I just want to briefly comment on some of the issues that have been highlighted by the policy briefs ECORIS has made, and your presentation in terms of the barriers and what can be done. I mean, one of the underlying issue, I think, the argument I want to put forward in this sense is that probably some of the challenges really run or should be addressed on focusing our monitoring and data collection efforts on the organizational level. I would say that we have quite good infrastructures and tools to collect data at the national level. And you mentioned these, like the SHE figures, the Gender Equality Index by EIGE, or the new Gender Equality Strategy Monitoring Portal. I think we're missing comparable infrastructures at the organizational level, and specifically when we talk about or when we want to capture GAP impact in terms of cultural change. And these instruments or these tools are really dearly needed if we want to address some of the issues that you have identified in the report. And let me just briefly explain the three issues that stick out. I mean, the first issue has to do with the GAP eligibility criterion for Horizon Europe. And as your report rightly states, there are currently no monitoring indicators regarding this eligibility criterion. We know relatively little about the prevalence and the characteristics of the GAPs throughout Europe in terms of the mandatory requirements they fulfill, or which of the 5 recommended thematic areas they address. So there are different options, of course, to get at this data, global centralized surveys, making some sort of questions part of existing surveys, or building it into the monitoring system that each of the project has to fulfill to REA. But I think if we really want to understand not only the numbers and features of the gaps, but also their impact, and this, it seems like really the core question, it's not going to be sufficient to collect simply the number of the, the type of GEPs that are out there. In the end, almost all Horizon Europe applicants will by definition satisfy this requirement, otherwise they couldn't participate, right? And the only way to assess impact then is really to examine at the organizational level, look at what changes have been made possible by the gaps, how the gender equality situation has been improved at the organizational level. And this means, more concretely, you have to go inside the organizations and ask people who work there, who study there, how their conditions, working conditions, have been improved. So it has been mentioned by previous speakers and also by the report that there is limited evidence on the impact of gaps. But, this is the way to get it, I would say. Go at the organizational level and monitor with good quality indicators what has changed. A second issue that you have rightly identified, I would say, is we face a huge challenge in terms of promoting and implementing inclusive gaps, and specifically the collection of intersectional data. Given the legal restriction in some countries, as you said, for the collection of sensitive personal data, it seems very unlikely that this is going to be done in a centralized way, like using, for example, administrative data or centralized surveys, because of these restrictions. But instead of seeing this really as a difficulty, I think maybe it's an opportunity, again, to go at the organizational level where we can work and ask about self-reported data from people working there. And I think it's an opportunity because the collection of the self-reported data, self-reported intersectional data, can be tied then really to the subsequent intervention that needs to be designed, to the gaps, of course. And the data is generated where it's most needed and where it's really understood, where it can be interpreted, of what needs to be done in order to improve the situation. And it's also an opportunity because right now there's a certain uncertainty, what it really means to collect intersectional data. And the only way to make this more specific is, I would say, to work with those minorities that we want to capture directly and talk with them, how should this be? What are the right way to record this type of data? And the third challenge I would like to comment on is we need to make sure that we do not confound the numerical balance between women and men at career stages or at decision-making positions with gender equality itself, right? I mean, there's a tendency in this whole data and monitoring business to go with the cheap and scalable indicators, so means administrative data, human resources data, but this is not the whole story. We need to get away from simply monitoring numerical participation to a more complex understanding of gender equality. And this is also especially clear in relation to gender-based violence and sexual harassment, right? I mean, we can have equal participation of a very diverse population, but we still can feel, unsafe, harassed, and work in a toxic environment. So again, I think it's not only about this numerical participation, but we need indicators that work at the level of experience of inclusion, if you want to use equality, diversity, inclusion. So the emphasis would be on feeling or having the experience of being included at the organizational level in your work environment. And this emphasis, just to close, in terms of, we need to build the capacity and infrastructure at the organizational level for high quality data collection. Also a capacity for more complex analysis. If the data gets more complex, you need to know approaches to make sense of this data. And also then build capacity for this mutual learning. If we have good high quality data, different organizations can talk to each other, learn from the experience, what works, what doesn't. And then this whole monitoring really becomes part of a learning process for organizational change. And that's back to you, Carmen. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jörg, for the remarks. And yes, definitely a lot needs to be done at the organizational level indeed. So I would like to introduce Angela Roblewski now. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. Her main areas of research include higher education research with a focus on gender, evaluation of equality policies in science, as well as education and labor market. So please, Angela, the floor is yours now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I agree with what has been already said, that the Horizon Europe GEP requirement is really a strong push towards ambitious and consequent gender equality policies at an institutional level. But at the moment, this is an assumption. And we assume that research organizations will develop and implement targeted gender equality policies, so targeted to its circumstances and concrete gender gaps. And we also assume what Ross has already mentioned, that these policies aim at cultural change. But on the other hand, we also know from experience over the last decades that institutions tend to develop policies which only require moderate change. And gender equality policies risk to become an add-on to existing structures and processes, but not necessarily aim at changing these structures and policies. And therefore, it's essential that research organizations are asked to verify if planned measures are implemented, if resources are committed to the implementation of a gender equality plan, and if the gender equality plan meets standards. And I agree to what Jörg has said, that the ideal option would be to collect data at institutional level, and also to have data collection really focusing on the planned implementation. So not the easy available information, but meaningful information. But in addition to that, I think we need a framework, a monitoring framework that ensures that something is done with this information. So if we do not have a framework which allows or provides the basis to discuss developments, to discuss what has worked, what did not work, why did something work, and what are barriers for other interventions to work. So such a framework is somehow necessary to secure or to guarantee that the monitoring does not become a data cemetery with a lot of information, which is seen as a burden by institutions. But if we have a monitoring framework which somehow comes close to our ideal formulation, we really have a good basis for a gender equality discourse. And I think that's really a key element of successful implementation of gender equality plans at national as well as at European level. So that's somehow a big challenge, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this framework. And back to you.
Brilliant, indeed. Very, very relevant remarks, Angela. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so I'd like to introduce now the rest of our panelists. Jörg and Angela, you already met, but also Adrian Brahim, who is a Senior Policy Officer for the Area and Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at Science Europe. And his areas of expertise include gender equality and anti-discrimination. And he's worked for several organizations in research policy. And he's a member of the Gender Action Plus Advisory Board. Also, Maria López Belloso, who is a lecturer and researcher at the Social and Human Science faculty at the University of Deusto. And her research is especially focused on the interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to human rights violations and gender equality. And she has participated also in several international research projects such as H2020 Gearing Roles, Resistiré, or Social B. And finally, Gary Loke, who is an inclusion and education consultant and former deputy chief executive of the Equality Challenge Unit, and has worked internationally, including leading his participation on the European Commission funded GenderNet, which was the first European research area network dedicated to the promotion of gender equality. And he's also a member of the Equality Commission of the Swiss National Science Foundation. So thank you very much for being here today. We are very much looking forward to your inputs and your remarks. In the interest of time, I think that if it's okay with you, I will address each of the questions to one or two panelists. Of course, feel free if you wish to switch around, or if you're a better place to answer another question, well, of course, you know better. But the first question that we wanted to pose here in this session today is, well, what are the main elements that you think should be included in a monitoring strategy for an inclusive GEP? So we've already touched a bit upon this, but perhaps Gary and Angela, you would like to add something here? So Gary, yeah.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Pam, for that. Thank you for the introduction. I think for me, having listened to Jörg and Angela, and early on, Monica said right from the beginning that one of the things that the report found was the kind of lack of quantitative data and how that's measured in evaluations. Having worked previously, kind of leading kind of the Athena Swan Charter and our work around the Race Equality Charter when I worked at the Equality Challenge Unit, I think one of the key issues for the monitoring evaluation is that it's not always considered right from the beginning in order to understand impact. Quite often, as Jörg and Angela have said, it's about numbers, about what kind of numbers we can look at. And I think what really needs to happen is to look beyond the numbers, to look at how we might collect data on the change of perspective, the change of culture, the change in attitudes. Very often I see evaluation reports of GEPs as, X number of people attended this training session as a way of justifying what the action is. And I think that is insufficient in terms of understanding, culture and culture change. And also quite often there is a lack of engagement, I think, with GEPs. So they become quite top level documents where individual researchers, individual students don't really know what the GEP is. And what I would like to see in evaluation strategies and monitoring strategies is how stakeholders who should be the subjects of these GEPs are engaged in this process, to understand their perspectives, their lived experience, and how that changes. And like I think, it needs to be an instrument that measures change over time. And I like Jörg's point earlier, is to focus on inclusion rather than diversity, because I think we have seen the experience in the UK where there is a lot of action on diversity. So you have an increased number of different groups of people in research, but they don't stay in research because environments like yours can be toxic. And I think one of the main elements should be understanding what does inclusion look like and how you build that into the monitoring and evaluation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gary. Yes, indeed, focus on inclusion rather than just pure diversity, for sure. Angela, I don't know if you'd like to quickly add anything.
I think it would be better to go on to give the others opportunity to speak.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, so the second question, what have been the main challenges or barriers your organization or country has faced in data collection for developing indicators for gender equality plans. I was thinking that perhaps Adrian, you can take this question and let us know your point of view on this.
Right, thank you very much. So I think so far for our members, there's quite a bit of few challenges for data collection and designing effective and high quality indicators. So obviously it's easier to define and collect data upon indicators that are quantitative and that relates, to men and women. There's a lot of, practices. There's a lot of already existing indicators that can be used. I think the first challenge is when you try designing and collecting data on more qualitative indicators in terms of how you process the data, how you collect it as well, and how you can compare that to different between different institutions, different grantee projects. That is probably the first challenge. The biggest challenge that we receive from members so far is collecting data that goes beyond men and women. There's obviously a lot of legal rules and different type of care you have to take when you try collecting data on race, ethnicity, religion. Not obviously not only legally but also in terms of ethics and integrity in your data collection. And there's an emerging problem that we start to see as well when we collect data, which is the problem of self-identification, because obviously you have to rely on self-identification for a lot of characteristics. But people, especially LGBT people, seem to be reluctant to appropriately self-identify because they fear discrimination that way. That identifying themselves to the project lead, to the university, entirely would expose them to be more discriminated against than they are right now. So the problem, how we design indicators in a way that sort of take that into account and ensure people's safety as well, because we know regardless of data we collect, there's a lot of discrimination and a lot of bullying, harassment, and I think UNICEF results show that as well, like with 75% of non-binary trans people being exposed to gender-based violence, for instance, across Europe. So that is something, that is a challenge, how you design your data collection, and should you have indicators or should you conduct qualitative research then, and how do you do that? And there's also a challenge on corresponding that data you collect with actual change in the work culture, in the harassment and equality between the different people. So how do you exploit the data to make sure that it's translated into change, and how do you identify gaps in the indicators that you've actually create and promote, and how you review them periodically to make sure that it keeps addressing the needs themselves. Thank you.
Yeah. Indeed. Thank you very much, Adrian. I think I'm going to move to the next question, and then perhaps we can come back to some of these points if we have time. The following question, we wanted to touch upon the actual inclusion of indicators on intersectionality in terms of inclusive GEPs. And well, I'd like to address this question to Maria, if that's okay. If your organization plans to include any indicators on intersectionality for an inclusive GEP, and if not, why not, or what the main challenges regarding their inclusion more generally you think are.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen, for the question. Currently, in the University of Deusto, we are evaluating the gender equality plan that we have implemented in the framework of the Gearing Roles project and designing the new one. And we are currently having these discussions on how to tackle intersectionality. That is one of the main challenges in all the process of the implementation of the GEP, but also in the monitoring of the actions that we have developed. And there are two issues that have been discussed, at least from our point of view, regarding intersectionality. As it has been mentioned before, one important point of designing the monitoring process of the GEPs is to think about the monitoring process from the early stages of the design of the GEP and from the very beginning. And it has to do also with raising awareness and capacity building within the whole community of the university and the community that is going to be affected by the gender equality plan. And when we have been tackling this in the institution and also in the Green Rose project, sometimes we found that instead of raising this awareness, the concept of intersectionality, if it is not well understood, is sometimes try to be instrumentalized in order to also to dilute and to avoid focusing in the real discourse of gender equality when we are, and I'm thinking especially when we are talking about leaders that found an opportunity of saying, of course, we have to tackle gender equality from an intersectional perspective, so then we are going to focus only on migrants or minority groups at the university, without having into account that intersectionality is a transversal issue that affects all minorities in the community of the university. So how we tackle this when we were not only designing the actions, but also implementing them, we try to include in all the actions a reflection about privilege in all the different groups. When we were working with the leaders, when we were working with different researchers and lecturers of the university, and of course this has been different in the 6 institutions that have been participating in the Green Rose project, but it was a key issue to discuss about privilege, how different privileges are present, and this helped us to understand the real sense of intersectionality. I think that was it for the question. I would be happy to go in deep if you wish.
No, very interesting, Maria. Thank you very much for sharing that experience. And indeed, yeah, some challenges arise that you didn't even think of before, no? Like this changing of the discourse, etc., and how to address that. Okay, before we move to the last question, I don't know if anyone wants to quickly add anything on this regard, since we are talking quite a lot about intersectionality and inclusive GEPs. If not, I'll move to the 4th question.
Carmen, may I add something? I think, from my perspective, I think intersectionality is really important. And I think the UK perhaps has been fairly good at data collection over the years, and that's given us the ability to have intersectional data. But the reason I say this is that without intersectionality, you lose perspective on small groups. So, the latest figures in the UK, for example, out of 23,000 professors in the UK, 41 are Black women. We're not talking women here, we're talking Black women. And yet the Black population in the UK is quite a large population. It's a significant minority population. And if we just focus efforts not thinking about how these things intersect, then we lose a real area of challenge for us. But I think more importantly is not just the data collection, but the application of it. So what do you do with that data? How do we move beyond and I say this as someone who thinks about this quite a lot, how do we move beyond a fairly theoretical application of intersectionality, which is what happens quite a lot, to a policy and practice level? Because many European legal systems, for example, don't recognize the ability to apply intersectionality on a true level. It's not a compounded disadvantage, it's seen as an additive disadvantage. So I think the real question for us is the discourse on how do we move that into practice and policy, and remaining true to the fact that we do want this data and we want to create change in culture.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you very much, Gary, for that. Okay, so let's move to the last question, which talks about national monitoring frameworks and any that you have found useful in your experience for your organization or your country regarding the effective implementation of GEPs, but also inclusive GEPs. So I don't know if perhaps Adrian, you'd like to take this question, or Jörg or Angela, feel free. Maria raised her hand, so please, Maria.
Yeah, I would like to discuss this question because I think that Spain has been one of the best practices in terms of a national framework regarding gender equality. But in our experience, and this is something that we have also discussed with other Spanish universities, of course, a national monitoring framework that help us to collect indicators and that provides also a framework that requires the implementation of GEPs for institutions such as universities or research centers, help the implementation of the GEP. But also we have to take into account what are the challenges that these frameworks and these combinations of frameworks pose to universities. And I'm referring here to the combination of the eligibility criteria of having a GEP from the European Commission and the building blocks and the criteria that are beyond the eligibility criteria of the GEP and also the national regulation in Spain. And we find here an imbalance on the two criteria. While the Spanish framework is just focusing on the employment conditions, working conditions, pay gaps, and mainly allocating a really important role to trade unions, this results on really difficulties and barriers for institutions and especially for universities when trying to implement other measures that are not linked to the national framework. And this results in sometimes having gaps for institutions that and for universities that can be applied to any other kind of institutions because they do not take into account, for example, sexual harassment in universities or gender mainstreaming in lectures and teaching. So I think that, of course, national monitoring frameworks are useful and they are a really big help, but also it is good to have into account what is the balance and how they combine with the overall framework of the European Union.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Maria. So perhaps quickly, Gary, I think you raised your hand first, and then we can finalize with Angela.
Thanks, Carmen. I'm going to go slightly off piece in a sense. It's not a national monitoring framework, but I think the experience of working on the Athena Swan and the Race Equality Charter in the UK has given us some kind of framework about monitoring. It's not a national framework, but I think for me, the perspective on this is about peer review. As an academic community, we are very used to peer review. And actually, Athena Swan and the Race Equality Charter are built on this concept of peer review. But we don't peer review each other's GEPs, and I wonder why we don't. You know, the current GEP eligibility criteria for the EU is a self-declaration. And maybe we should build something in there about peer review, learning from each other, but also getting each other to assess each other's work, because that's a way of learning. And that's also a way of getting some externality to make sure that, you know, what you're saying is something that's useful. So for me, let's hark back to the academic community and think about peer review in this.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that, Gary. So Angela, please.
Yeah, I would like to support what Maria has already said and stress the point that it would be really important to have a national monitoring framework which is in line with the European monitoring framework or the monitoring of the gender equality plan requirement in Horizon Europe. We see at national level, at least in Austria, that the building blocks by Horizon Europe, defined by Horizon Europe, are not the same as the national law defines. And also in the monitoring, there are probably discrepancies. So the Austrian one is already to be developed. But what I think is really important from the institution's perspective, that they have one approach and one framework which they should follow. And I think it is part of also a national policy and a discourse about this national policy to try to bring these requirements into one perspective or one line, to make it also easier for institutions to somehow follow these requirements or these expectations.
Definitely, yeah. Make it easier to institutions, make it comparable, make it consistent, standardized, for sure. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for your contributions. Sorry, because I think we took a bit longer than was planned, but that was very insightful. I'll give the floor back to my colleague Andrea now, who's the moderator. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Carmen, and thank you very much to all the panelists. That was a very interesting session. We are running a bit behind. We were 10 minutes late starting, of course, so we are coming to a coffee break now. So I would suggest maybe we take a slightly shorter break, maybe just by a couple of minutes, and reconvene at 12, if that's okay. So we are running a little bit later, but we hope to make up some time during the final panel session. And also, we will be able to go slightly beyond time if you can stay for that. We have collected quite a lot of questions in the Slido. I've been monitoring them, and some of them I think have already been addressed to some extent, I think, in the discussion. I mean, the most popular one is about how the quality of GEPs should be evaluated by the EU to ensure that it's not just a tokenistic document that institutions create. That's quite an interesting question. And I see Anne's put in the chat that she would like to take the question before the break. So maybe the colleagues from the Commission could talk to that. Although I have to say also that what Gary said just now was very interesting about peer review between academic organisations, and that could go some way to solving that question. Another popular question was about how we expect to find quantitative data on the impact of GEPs. So that is something, and how would we do that? How long would that take? Maybe my colleague Monica could maybe talk to that. And also there's another question about the benchmarking results that we showed from our study. It said that we showed limited evidence of impact on gender equality. Limited evidence on impact of gender equality in R&I productivity. And how would we interpret that? So maybe we just have a couple of minutes then before the break to take those questions. And thank you for your questions.
Okay, so should I answer the first one on how the EU will tackle
Yes, please do.
The monitoring? I think many of the speakers that have already spoken hinted to the fact that it's, of course, there is the eligibility criterion into Horizon Europe, and we will be actually carrying out compliance checks. Indeed, these will be compliance checks on random samples and focusing on the process-related mandatory requirements. But then ensuring the quality of the gender equality plans is, you're asking how the EU will do that. Well, the EU is not only the Commission, it's also the member states. And it's actually
quite a focus of the European Research Area framework that was also developed in your presentation, Carmen, quite quickly, that the new European Research Area policy agenda for 2022-2024 will come up with common indicators on the progress of the different actions of this policy agenda. And there is one that is specifically on inclusive gender equality in the European Research Area. So we will devise together and with a study team and with the member states, the associated countries, and stakeholder organizations. And Adrien, who just spoke for the research funding organization, is also part of this subgroup that will reflect on how to best monitor the implementation of inclusive gender equality policies and inclusive gender equality plans. So there will be EU level indicators and national level indicators that we will follow. But as it was said, quantitative indicators are not sufficient. So we need to look also down to the level of organization. And this is also the responsibility of the national level players. And it was clearly said that we need to find some let's say, some agreement, some compliance between the way we monitor indicators. We also already have quite a pan-European set of indicators that are more quantitative, and we publish those every 3 years through the She-Figures publication, and we're now trying to develop and preparing the next publication, so the 2024 She-Figures, in which we want to introduce new indicators, and we're working with experts on trying to develop the most relevant and pan-European indicators that we could collect. So these are a few elements of responses, but this is something we are working on, but it's also a collective responsibility. And I think it's the political step of requiring this in order to get funding, we are seeing, and I think the study shows that it's starting to work, but we need to monitor indeed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, for that contribution. I hope that helps everybody. Monica, did you want to say just a couple of words? I think there are a couple of questions on the presentation that you gave right at the beginning on the findings on the impact of GEPs.
Chloe, very quick, thank you. Thank you for all the questions that you're asking, and I'm very sorry we can't do justice to all of them. So quickly on the question that's asking when we expect to find quantitative data on GEP impact and how long would this take, I think a short answer from me is that it mainly depends on two aspects. The first would be the type of indicator that we're looking at. So some indicators can be collected a lot more easily, and we can, so for example, the output indicators, Jörg was mentioning them, but they're not enough. So looking at and measuring and understanding outcome indicators takes a lot longer. And then the second factor that would influence the duration needed for quantitative data to become available and for us to understand it is when actually the monitoring process starts. So of course we have the GEPs that are set up in some organizations more and more as a result of various factors. But does the monitoring framework associated with the implementation of the GEP come along with it, and when does it come along? When does it start? So when does the information start being collected and analyzed? So when in terms of timing, this is quite varied and will of course depend from one country to another, from one institution to another. But a solid, cohesive monitoring framework, or at least a few indicators that are agreed at the EU and national level would of course help a lot. So it can also be something that's done in stages to try to understand what the impact of GEPs is on really the key indicators related to gender equality, not just processes. And then the second question asks if the results, indicates that the results on benchmarking showed limited evidence on impact of impact on gender equality on R&I productivity, but this was a finding from the survey. So we have different types of evidence. The general assessment that there is still limited evidence in the international initiatives that we looked at is also based on quantitative data that's collected consistently within these initiatives across the institutions that are part of these initiatives. However, the research that we did and also the information from the survey does point to some perceptions of impact, which comes from the stakeholders that answered the survey, but also the other stakeholders that we consulted, which provided some useful qualitative information. So again, overall, that there is this balance that needs to be achieved between qualitative and quantitative data. Both of them are extremely and equally important, but also both of them we need to work together and to give us a broader answer and framework.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. I hope that's helped with the understanding of our research results. As we said, we can't really do justice to all the questions in Slido, but thank you very much for the questions. And I think that some of them have been the subject of some of the chat as well. So there are questions about far right and anti-gender discourse and movements and parties, and I think that has been a subject of a few exchanges in the chat. So I hope that people continue to interact on these types of issues. But we will take a break now. Shall we reconvene at 10 past? Is that okay with everybody? Okay, all right. So we'll have a well-earned break and I'll see you again at 10 past. So thank you very much, everybody, for your contribution, your attention so far. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're just waiting for the presentation to be shared again, and then we'll get underway with the third panel, which I will moderate. Okay.
Sandra, can you see everything properly?
Everything is fine. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Very good. Okay. All right. So welcome back, everybody. We're now going to get into the third panel of this workshop. So this panel, the focus of this panel is how to facilitate the development of inclusive GEPs in the new European research area, and focusing on the opportunities, challenges, and policy gaps. So I'm going to say a few words at first, but I'm going to keep it quite brief because I'm aware that a lot of the things on the slides that we've prepared are actually have been touched on already in the presentation so far in the discussions. So I really want to make the focus on the panelists. But we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide is all about the main challenges and the policy gaps in the implementation of inclusive GEPs. And obviously, a lot of the challenges and the policy gaps are very similar, or in fact the same, that those that relate to GEPs, gender equality. So I will whiz through this a little bit, and we've organised the slide in terms of the national level gaps. So of course, I think this applies to all types of GEPs, including inclusive GEPs. If you don't have the national level policy framework and supporting measures, then we found, so certainly our research found, and I think the discussions found as well, that it's quite difficult for institutions to develop policies at their own initiative. So I think that's the first thing to say. There are also a number of contextual factors, and I think this was also touched on in the questions in the Slido. So there are things like labour market inequalities, not just for women, but for other people with other types of protected characteristics. COVID-19 has had an impact in terms of putting gender and other types of equality objectives onto the back burner, as it were, while organisations dealt with other issues connected with the pandemic. Hopefully, the next few years that might then change again. Of course, there are lots of different types of beliefs around in society about gender or other protected characteristics. So that includes biases around gender roles, stereotypes around women's skills, but other types of biases as well that touch on different types of protected characteristics. And of course, we've heard quite a bit today and also in the chat about the barriers that institutions face in terms of they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough dedicated staff or technical support, time and funding, of course, as well as a big issue. They might have limited support from their staff and the management, including senior management, and that's because people aren't really aware of inequality, and certainly in terms of inclusive GEPs, that takes on another layer as well. There might also be, and we've heard already a little bit about this, a lack of data to inform the development of the GEPs and the difficulties in finding the data for inclusive GEPs, which is the next section there. So data collection on protected characteristics is not legal in some countries, so that is an extra barrier, very difficult barrier to overcome. And there might also be cultural resistance to trying out more inclusive approaches to equality. So these are things I think that have been touched on already a little bit in our discussions so far, but it would be very interesting to hear more from the panel a bit later. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so opportunities. So our research did showcase a number of good practices, and we've split these into national level success factors and institutional level success factors. So on the national level, I suppose it's the flip side of what we presented in terms of the challenges. So if you do have a well-developed national policy framework that supports development of GEPs or supports equality more broadly, this can really be a positive thing. So this could be, for example, we found a policy element that acted as a mandate for the implementation of a GEP rather than recommendation, and that led to more widespread GEP adoption in a particular country. So it really does make a difference if you have that enabling framework. In addition to that, financial capacity building support that is targeted can also make a difference, as can awareness raising, so that will tackle issues about people not knowing or not knowing why it's important. Monitoring frameworks, we've already heard quite a lot about that. That can also make a real difference in terms of collection of data that's comparable. So that can really set up the basis for what for the actions that are then undertaken. So we have a good practice there from Ireland, which I'm sure many of you know about. So the implementation of a policy in Ireland means that higher education institutes lose up to 10% of their core funding if they do not have an Athena Swan Award. And since that, the GEP presence in those institutions increased from 11 in 2016 to 98 by April last year. So that's real clear evidence of the impact of that policy in Ireland. At institutional level, number of success factors. For example, evidence-based approaches, so based very firmly on literature, or if organisations carry out a needs assessment of a specific context. So that is, if it's very firmly rooted in evidence, that can be a very strong approach. As can mainstreaming or embedding principles of equality throughout the organisation. So not just paying lip service or making it the province of a small number of people, but actually making it something that is mainstreamed across the whole organisation. Of course, resources and specific targeted expertise are crucial, so it's important that these are made available, as is the commitment from senior management, because of course, if senior management buys into the process, then that will trickle down the organisation. And in terms of communication, so creating networks both within an organisation and across different organisations or institutions, that can also help to share good practice, share thoughts, and build a community. So we have a good practice there. So on the Horizon projects that bring together a number of different organisations, and that can lead to efficiencies and sharing of best practices, and also awareness raising on types of equality issues. It can also lead to capacity building, which then supports the implementation of GEPs. So that is something that we have found. So it's good to talk, it's good to share experiences, and good to communicate and create and build these networks. Okay, we can have the next slide. Okay, so I won't go through all of these in detail, but just to say that we have, our research gave recommendations for inclusive GEPs at 3 levels, so institutional level, national level, and EU level. So institutional level, long-term commitment, very important to make sure it's embedded. It's important people have the right types of skills, so it's important to assess the training needs that address inequalities and unconscious bias for gender and other types of characteristics as well. It's also important to assess recruitment, retention, and progression policies so that equal opportunities for everybody is supported. Reviewing research funding eligibility is also vital, and as is the strong collection of equality data, because that will underpin everything. So that's an overview of recommendations at institutional level. At national level, it's things like enabling national funding instruments to complement what's available at EU level, fostering collaboration and dialogue between relevant stakeholders about intersectionality and inclusive GEPs to build a community and a dialogue, investing in monitoring evaluation frameworks in order to track the progress of inclusive GEPs to see what's going on and see whether things are improving. And that can then inform equality actions. So it's based on robust data and evidence. And at EU level, within the new ERA policy agenda. So to support the development and implementation and monitoring evaluation through coordination, guidance, capacity building, mutual learning, sharing of practices, those sorts of things, to support the expansion of quality data in European R&I and the consistency of monitoring and evaluation approaches, to continue to conduct dissemination activities. This has been very successful, I think. So to continue to do that on the GEP eligibility criterion, to ensure continued coordination with what's going on in member states, because countries can very much learn from each other, and to encourage the carrying out of assessments of GEPs and other gender equality policies more broadly, so that we can see what the benefits of these are, so we have evidence of what works and what works well to support future actions. Okay, so that's a quick whiz through what we found in terms of our research. I wanted to save time for the panelists, so I'm first of all going to turn to Marcela Linkova. She's the head of department and researcher at the National Contact Centre for Gender and Science at the Institute of Sociology, Czech Academy of Sciences, and her field of specialisation includes impacts of research assessment and the dynamisation in research on knowledge, organisations and subjectivities and the ways these processes are gendered. She's also interested in exploring practices through which gender equality policies and projects are adopted and implemented at the European level and at the national level in the Czech Republic, with a specific focus on cultural and institutional change through gender equality plans. Marcela, please, the floor is yours to say a few words. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for the introduction. So I will focus specifically on the inclusiveness that is addressed here. I think that what we have now is a broad agreement that intersectionality is the logical next step, that we need to adopt a gender plus approach to advancing gender equality at the intersection with the other axes of inequality. And what is the major challenge is how we talk about inclusiveness and intersectionality and how to do it. Because we have very little in terms of policy and we have very little in terms of practice. And we have been hearing about some of the obstacles to this. So first in order, and this is what we're doing now in Gender Action Plus, is to see whether and exactly what member states have in place in relation to intersectionality and inclusiveness. And one initial finding that I can mention is that we see attention to different axes of inequality, but in an additive model, where one inequality is placed next to the other. But this, of course, does not mean that we are tackling intersectional inequality on the basis of multiple grounds of inequality. This is also related to the issue of indicators, just discussed in the previous session. And so what do we want to measure? Because the indicators are really tricky. And so do we want to measure the institutionalization of gender equality actions as a proxy of the broader impact? So here, there is the impact drivers model developed in Casper. Do we use quantitative statistics on representation, which we had in the previous ERA monitoring mechanism? But we have the wonderful analyses done by Angela Wroblewski in Gender Action that showed the limits of this approach, and that the statistics on women's representation can be used in and of itself, but has to be accompanied by broader institutional aspects. And then Jörg was mentioning impact in terms of working conditions and perceptions of gender plus equality. And so here we may have the gender equality culture survey that was, for example, used in one of the sister project EGERA already in the seventh framework program. And we have already discussed this as well, is we have to be aware of the fact that the concept of diversity is sometimes strategically used, or rather misused, as a policy of inequality under gender equality front. So diversity is sometimes done and used to divert attention from gender equality, to dilute the issue, put it in the background. And we have already heard, I think Gary mentioned it, that of course diversity does not mean inclusion, does not mean recognition. And we often see institutional leaders, and I have heard it so many times, invoke diversity. And my immediate reaction is, okay, so if diversity is now the way to go, and we can't stay only with gender equality, tell me exactly what your institution is doing in this respect. And they usually stay quiet because there's so little done. And then the second issue that I want to mention is how we operationalize intersectional theory into practice. And here, my huge hopes are with the Inspire Center of Excellence, of course. And we really need to think how to translate the theory into ways of working at the institutional level. And I think that here the cooperation between the gender and feminist scholars and practitioners is absolutely crucial. And we will need to find ways how to do things on the ground. And this has already been mentioned as well already, I think, by Jörg, working with the different groups that should be positively affected by intersectional and inclusive measures. Here, their experience, what they need, what would inclusiveness mean to them, and what would need to happen for them to feel included. And I think this task is really crucial. And I just want to underscore it because in recent times, I have had such staggering experience in top echelons of academia with racism. And we need to really tackle gender plus inequality, attend to race and ethnic inequality and other types of inequalities, because this is rampant in European research. And I think that the time is really now for us to engage and develop the language for us to discuss and develop the discourse. And I'm really happy that we will have opportunities to do this in the ERA subgroup under the ERA Forum on Inclusive Gender Equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcella. There's obviously lots to do still, and you highlighted some of the real key challenges here with intersectionality and inclusivity. Okay, thank you. I'll now pass the floor to Florian Holzinger, who is a senior researcher in the Johanneum Research Center for Economic Innovation and Research, and his research focuses on the influence of gender on innovation systems and on governance issues in science, technology, and in innovation. He's also contributed to a range of projects, including SPEAR and Granted. So please, Florian, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I recognize that the time is already very short, and I decided therefore to skip my long and maybe quite boring statement to make just a few comments. Building on what has been discussed so far by many of my previous colleagues speaking previously. So I agree a lot that we need better and more monitoring, evaluation, research, and GEP implementation impact, and especially in the future for inclusive or intersectional approaches, as stated by many of the speakers before, and that we need to look beyond the mere numbers.
We're finding it quite hard to hear you, Florian. I don't know whether you're a bit far away from the microphone.
No, maybe I'm better now. Okay, maybe I choose another.
This is worse.
Better now? No? Can you hear me? No, you can't hear me. How does it work? Can you hear me? Hello?
We hear you from afar. Okay. Can you speak louder, Florian?
Even louder, okay. Okay. So the evidence that will be produced by such evaluation or research studies needs to be, in my opinion, also much more contextualized. So it's good to have indicators at the European or national level, but we need to understand what works in which organizational, social, and cultural contexts. And I think this is even more relevant and important when it comes to intersectional approaches to understand why are they working and in which context. And I think this will enable us to design more tailored and effective chats, inclusive chats, and facilitate maybe also a sharing of knowledge and experience, and to foster a dialogue between stakeholders. But if you think about impact, I would also urge to think beyond the impacts of gender equality measures on reducing gender inequalities or other axes of inequality, but to take into account also how a more inclusive approach to gender equality can and certainly will contribute also to other strategic agendas and objectives of R&I organizations. So to connect the gender equality agenda more closely to other ongoing strategic transformation in the research and innovation system. And the most obvious, of course, are discussions around career development and recruitment systems. And we heard already how this can be changed through gender equality, but also about ways of conducting, new ways of conducting research assessments. So I think we can show how gender equality and more inclusive approaches to gender equality can contribute and improve these kind of processes and procedures, and we need to think about to show this impact, to make it more evident for future, to plan future activities. Okay, now stop here. I hope you could understand me.
Yes, thank you. The sound went in and out of it. I actually turned up my volume and that helped. So thank you for your thoughts, Florian. And we'll hear from you again a bit later in the panel discussion. So I'll move on now to the discussion and introduce the other two speakers. So we have Karin Gilland-Lutz, and Karin is Deputy Head of the Office for Gender Equality and Diversity at the University of Zurich, and co-chair of the LERU policy group Equality, Diversity, Inclusion. And some of her main areas of focus include the Horizon Europe Gender Equality Plan and academic recruiting in an open science environment. So welcome, Karin. And our other panelist is Anne Pepin, who is Senior Policy Officer in the Gender Sector of the European Commission's Director General for Research and Innovation, that's DG RTD, where she is in charge of gender equality policies in the European research area and of their implementation through dedicated provisions in the Horizon Europe Framework Programme for Research and Innovation. And she has, of course, coordinated several EU-funded projects that are devoted to the promotion of gender equality in higher education and research organisations. So welcome to all panelists. And I will start by, so we have a few minutes. We're going to go a little bit over time, and I hope that's okay for everybody. But we've got 3 questions there. I've also been keeping an eye on the Slido because there are a couple of quite interesting questions from the Slido as well. So I'll add those in as well, maybe as we go along. So maybe the first one is about the main challenges or barriers that either your organisation or your country has faced in the development and implementation of inclusive GEPs. Now, we already heard a bit about things like attitudes and data collection, but it'd be quite interesting to unpack that a little bit more. So maybe, first of all, Karin, maybe I could ask you your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that warm welcome, Andrea. And I'm very honored to be on this panel and to be here today to speak primarily as the chair of the LERU policy group on equality, diversity and inclusion. I myself represent the University of Zurich in that group. And for those of you who are not familiar with LERU, which means the League of European Research Universities, it's a network of 23 universities in 12 different countries across Europe. About 2/3 are in an EU country and 1/3 are outside of the EU, just so that you get a sense of where we are. In terms of challenges and barriers, when I was thinking about these questions and preparing myself for this panel today, it occurred to me that some of the aspects that are the main challenges are also the main opportunities at the same time. So in a way, I would have the same answer to the first two questions. But I'll talking about it in terms of the barriers, and I'm going to try deliberately not to repeat a lot of the things that have already been said. One of the main challenges besides data and everything else is that universities tend to be very decentralized organizations, which makes it really difficult to implement any kind of policy really from the top down. And I suppose the gender equality plans in a sense is a centralized document within the institution, and we have to fill it with life, and we have to include all the stakeholders within the organization. But given how decentralized the institution is and how varied different areas in different disciplines and institutes are, this presents quite a challenge in terms of bringing that all together into one sort of coherent movement for an institution in terms of moving closer to the aims and goals of an inclusive gender equality plan. At the same time, though, it has to be said, I think that this is also what makes universities very, very interesting as a type of organization. So there is that side to it as well. And I would just like to also point out a little bit what our benefit, or one big benefit for us working together as 23 institutions in terms of developing and implementing our GEPs, has been on an ongoing basis that we can not necessarily peer review each other. That would be probably going too far, but we can as peers act as critical friends on a trust basis in terms of trying to identify good and best practice between us, since we are institutions that have a long history of working together. So that has been very valuable in terms of trying to deal with all the challenges around the GEPs. So in the interest of time, I think I'll hand back the word there, Andrea, to you to proceed to the next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. And I think you illustrate really well the benefits of working together with different organisations and creating a really good network. So that's obviously very important. Anna, maybe I could turn to you for your thoughts. I mean, you've probably got a good overview, having been involved in this policy area for a long time at EU level. And maybe you can take maybe both of those questions together, actually, because as Karen said, they complement each other, the challenges, but also opportunities. Be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yes, and indeed, thanks, Andrea. Actually, yes, I will take my hat of the European Commission and not my previous hat of implementing a gender equality plan in a national organization. But what is clear here at the European Commission is, especially under this mandate, so under the President Ursula von der Leyen, it's really a strengthening priority. So there's a top level support and impetus with this European Commission. As you may know, there's the first time Commissioner for Equality, Elena Dalli, and under her, there is attached to the Secretariat General of the European Commission a task force on equality where all Directorate Generals are represented. So there are correspondents in all of the Directorate Generals that have to look at equality issues, including gender equality, but trying to implement an intersectional approach. So that's the ambition right now at the European Commission. And this is in the making. So there are still some obstacles, and many of those have been clearly spelled out. So treating different discrimination grounds separately or in an additive way rather than in truly intersectional way. So this is something that's under development. But as clearly stated in the first of a range of equality strategies that have been adopted by the Commission since 2020, the first one was the gender equality strategy. And there it's really clearly spelled out that an intersectional approach should be developed. And so some examples have been provided by other speakers. What we tried to do in the arena of the research and innovation was to launch a first pilot study on trying to map what existed at national level at the time. So 1.5 years ago on intersectional or inclusive policies, or looking at equality, diversity, and inclusion policies as well as national level. And what Marcella has already highlighted is very much reflected in this first pilot study. Now the knowledge will be deepened through the Gender Action Plus project, and the knowledge will also be developed, as she has said, through the Inspire project, which is really the center of excellence on inclusive gender equality that we have decided to fund through Horizon Europe and the widening participation and strengthening the European area, so the WIDERA work program. So that was really from the start of Horizon Europe, trying to look more deeply and try to develop the concept of what inclusive gender equality could really actually mean in the organizations, and how you can monitor that at that level, but also at national level and EU level. And like I said previously, that's also the task that we have set out for this new subgroup on inclusive gender equality attached to the new European research area policy agenda. So these are some elements. So yeah, so there when there's top leadership push and a bottom-up understanding, a research-based understanding and development of what it can mean, then hopefully we can achieve something at EU level.
That's great. Thank you very much, Anne. It's really good to hear just more of the detail of what the EU is doing to support all of this. Okay, maybe Marcella, I could come to you. I mean, you set out in your original few words some of the challenges or the barriers. So I don't know whether you want to expand on that, or maybe also include some of the enabling factors in your view for inclusive GEPs.
Thank you very much. Yeah, maybe I will mention what we find really useful or what has worked for us in the Czech Republic. And so, of course, I'm representing here the Center for Gender and Science at the Institute of Sociology. And we were established with the funding from the Ministry of Education in 2001. And I really have to say that this really long-term support from the ministry has been so vital. We have functioned as the national contact point for gender equality, for many years. And the fact that we have been able to follow the policy developments, harness the policy developments when they come in handy, because you have to learn to use them as well. And of course, the role of the Commission with the advice expert group and exercise back in 2004 was really crucial for starting the debate in the Central and Eastern Europe, and we have had that support ever since. So this is one thing, because we were then really able to continually develop our capacities, trust within the community, liaisons with institutional stakeholders. And so now when the GEP requirement came, we were like, hey, we have been saying this all along, come to us, you have us. And suddenly we come really handy. And so I would really urge all member states, all national authorities to give funding. I mean, we're not very expensive. I tell you that, we're not very expensive. All member states have money to set up gender equality NCP to support their organizations and develop expertise. So that's one. Second, and I really want to stress this, the European Commission, we need sustained attention to gender equality as a policy priority. We must never allow this to go off the radar. This has happened in the past. We have ups and downs in the policy. We have to keep the thing in its rails, on track. And the 2012 communication and then 2015 Council conclusions, these were brilliant policy instruments that we can then, go back to and say, look, you're supposed to do this. So we need this. And when I was starting this in 2001, I had no idea why policy documents are important. I now know. So I would urge, also all the practitioners to keep abreast of these developments, because really you can use it to your advantage. And one last thing that I want to mention is the critical role of gatekeepers. We see it at the EU level. I mean, every time there's a female commissioner, things happen. And I mean, this is a fact. We have the same in the Czech Republic. We had the first female president of the Technology Agency of the Czech Republic. Things started happening there. They joined the GECO. Now they were the first to have gender equality policy. They have gender sensitive communication, all of that. Things can happen. We need to be able to use the developments strategically and take advantage of every single opportunity that presents itself, because we can build slowly on this, and we can also support each other internationally. So yeah, these are the good things that are happening in the Czech Republic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's really good to hear. And I suppose it's about knowledge is power. So sort of keeping a good overview on what's happening and then being able to react in a good position to be able to react. So that's a really good point, I think. So I'll turn to Florian now for your thoughts on either challenges or opportunities, enabling factors in your experience, in your view, please.
Yes, many thanks. I also would like to reflect on the Austrian context and the policy framework that was developed there. And I think that it is quite a good and complex policy framework, but it still has some gaps that I think are important for looking into the future and learning for implementing inclusive gender equality plans in the future. So the one gap is, of course, and this is mentioned several times already, is that it's not equipped with sufficient resources. So, and not for all organizations. So I think it is always said it is a priority, but then it's not kind of handled in terms of resources. That's the one gap. The other gap is that it does not really engage all research and innovation organizations. So it's focused very tightly on universities, but has left out for quite a long time also other types of organizations. They were not really targeted effectively, or it could slip through the net, more or less. So, and these were, for instance, also public non-university research organizations, but of course also research companies. And this was due because there was no kind of consequences for non-compliance with not taking care of gender equality, not talking about that they had to have a GEP early on, or that there is no common monitoring. So there's a monitoring for specific public research organizations, but it does not include all of them. And it doesn't, it's not kind of comparable to the monitoring for universities. And I think the framework is also not ready for including an intersectional approach. And I also would like to agree with what Marcela has said. We need this framework still. And we need the resources for gender equality work, and the continued attention and focus on this activity. Yeah, that would be my reflection from the Austrian case.
Okay, thank you very much, Florian. Okay, so we have just a few minutes more. We have a third question, which is about any additional elements that should be considered in the context of how to develop and how to implement inclusive GEPs. We've heard about quite a lot of issues, things like attitudes, data. So I don't know, I'll leave the floor open to anybody who wants to say anything about any other additional elements that I think are important to raise here. So anybody, please. Yes, Karen.
Thank you very much. Maybe just two things. I would like to pick up on what was said about review in some previous panels. That was really music to my ears. And I noted last week that the European Commission awarded 4 awards in the area of gender equality plans, and 3 of them went to Ireland. The 4th went to Sweden. And so obviously that that makes you think, what's going on in Ireland? And we've mentioned already several times 2016, the report, Athena Swan, and so on and so forth. But I do think it's interesting also to note that Athena Swan has a fairly robust assessment system for the action plans that are sort of the core of Athena Swan. And I think that gives us food for thought going forward. And I'd like to draw attention, obviously, to the fact that Trinity College, that won one of the awards, is a member of LERU, and we have Eileen here on the call with us, who has been a very important part of that history leading up to last week and today. So that's one point, assessment, be that some mechanism for peer assessment or however that's done. I think that's absolutely key. And then going maybe slightly outside the GEPs, if I may, for a moment, I place the GEPs, or we often do in our conversation, in the ERA Policy Agenda Action 5, where it is explicitly defined as a cross-cutting issue. So we think that beyond the GEPs themselves, it's also very important to keep a firm eye on whether equalities are laced into the implementation of the other actions in the ERA policy agenda. And we think that can be as important as well. And we're constantly also talking about that within our LERU community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. As you can see in the chat, we have a maximum of 10 more minutes, probably 8 minutes now. So unless anybody has anything, yes, Marcella, please.
Thank you very much. No, if I can very briefly, I just want to go back to the issue of gender-based violence. It has been mentioned several times, and I just want to underscore how critical this is. I mean, it is one of the obligatory elements in the GEPs, but we need to do more. We need to make it obligatory. We need to introduce it as an obligatory element in international collaborations. We need to think of ways how to do this, because gender-based violence is an expression of the inequality. It does not happen elsewhere. It is the inequality. It's just one expression of it. And from the smallest snaps, remarks, it then escalates into the more serious cases. But we often deal only with the aftermath of the serious cases. We need to develop the tools, and UNICEF is doing that, to really look at where it starts. And I think since we have a growing consensus that gender-based violence is an issue and needs to be tackled, I think that it presents an opportunity to go deeper into the really, nuanced ways in which inequality manifests and allows us to speak about it, which maybe is more difficult otherwise because we have so much resistance to discussing biases, etc. But when we frame it as an issue of violence that needs to be eradicated, I think that this gives us new opportunities. And so I really want to keep this issue at the forefront of what we do, and the zero tolerance that is to be developed in the new era is really a crucial element of this. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marcel. I think that is a really interesting point and a very, very important point. And as you say, it's a complex issue as well, so it's multifaceted, but it's very important to keep that at the forefront of discussion. So I think we're drawing to the end of our time. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists for this session. It's been really, really interesting. And I'm sorry we haven't had more time to go deeper into these issues because they're really important issues. And I know that people have a lot to say on them. So thank you very much. And I don't know whether Katja is still here for the closing remarks, but if not, I'll hand over to you for closing remarks.
Yes, sorry, she unfortunately had to leave, but I'll be happy to deliver the final remarks, the closing remarks. And really, I want to thank you, Ecoris, as well as the IFIS and the Visionary Analytics Partner for your work with this study, and also for the preparation for today's event. And thank the steering group members. So you had 4 on our panels today. Ross, Angela, Florian, Marcella, and I'm forgetting one. Sorry, who am I forgetting?
Jörg.
Jörg, sorry, Jörg. And also, I'd like to thank the sixth one of our external experts. So Heidi Zakariasen from the KIF committee in Norway, who couldn't be here today. And I'd like also to thank our internal colleagues. So Eleni Papadimitriou from the JRC, the Joint Research Center, as well as colleagues from the Research Executive Agency. So Catarina Buse and Raquel Fernandez Orcajada, they have also supported the delivery of this study. I want to thank all panelists really for your insights, and also thank the live audience that we had for asking some very relevant questions that we will follow up upon. And I'd also like to thank my gender sector colleagues, as well as the DG Research and Innovation Communication and the web team, really, without which maybe we would not have had live streaming. You don't know what happened during those 10 minutes at the beginning, the delay that we had. So thanks to them, this has been working quite well. And also important to say that today's presentation, of course, are only the key findings. There will be a fact sheet published soon that will summarize these key findings, but the full report contains much more material, much more detail on the case studies and the benchmarking as well. And this is also complemented by the set of 7 policy briefs that you've heard about. So this will be published also soon, hopefully at the end of the month. And that will be on the EU's publication office. And links to it will also be available through this RNI community platform. This study serves as a basis for further work, and that's work that's already ongoing. So you've heard about the Gender Action Plus project and the Inspire project, so both funded under the 2021 work program of Widera in Horizon Europe. You've heard as well that I'm not sure I said it already, but yesterday we launched the subgroup of the ERA Forum, which is the governance structure for the new European Research Area policy agenda for 2022-2024. And we elected Marcela Linkova as a co-chair with the Commission to this expert group. So we are in safe hands for advancing with the implementation of the different deliverables. And there's one in particular, indeed, on the EU baseline on gender-based violence. So hopefully also at national and institutional levels, the results of this study can be picked up. There are more knowledge building and analysis that are going on the side of what we're doing already, and that's coming up, supported by the Commission. There will be a public procurement on the gender equality competence facility that will hopefully help at the national level those member states and associated countries that are a little less advanced in the implementation of gender equality plan to best comply with the GEP eligibility criterion and to implement quality gender equality plans. So there will be also support for trainings on the implementation of gender equality plans. So this will be a call for tender that will be launched shortly. We also fund under the Widera Work Program some peer mentoring projects. So 3 have been launched already. So it's more advanced institution helping some less advanced one from the widening countries to implement measures on inclusive gender equality. So this has started and there will be more funding coming up. And so there's also much room to improve on the GEP eligibility criterion itself. There's a a new strategic planning phase for the remainder of Horizon Europe, so 2025, 2027, that is ongoing now. So evolutions are possible. We're also already thinking about the next framework program and how rules and the architecture and the support and provisions for gender equality and inclusiveness can be further strengthened in the next framework program. So this is to say that the road ahead has a few challenges, but really a lot of opportunities, and working together in different networks at national level, at European level, I'm confident that we will advance on this issue. So keep posted on our advancement. You can also check our policy page, and I think the time is running out and I'll be shortly cut. So just thanks for your attention today. Have a nice afternoon and goodbye.